So I threw in week 9. Work. So in week 9, I put the risk matrix assignment, and I put all the pieces together in one big folder so you can get to it, including the risk matrix assignment. So this needs to be turned in, and I looked at it, and not a single group or people or anybody had turned it in, so I was okay with this. You're going to do this as an individual assignment. You have 3 choices of assignments. If you guys have worked in a group, you can substitute in the material you've got. Essentially, I turned it into, instead of 20, you have to turn in 16 if you want an A. 16 good ones that it makes sense, and all this is filled in. 14 is a B. 12 is a C, I think I have in there in the scale. In other words, how many you turn in relates to how well you will do in that. There's 3 cases. So the Deepwater Horizon, so if you've already been working on one with a group, you can fill that out. We'll give you some time, hopefully even in here. Some of you have a computer, some of you don't, so we'll do it at the end. So, groups, not working very well at all. So no more group assignments for the rest of the semester. I will never do group assignments in this class again, I think, because that just went horribly wrong. Part of it's the nature of this year where we have people switching in and out, and we've had some health issues other than COVID even. I've had to take off a day or so. So it's been an interesting mix of all kinds of things. So what we're going to do for the final then is you're going to have kind of a take-home final. There will not be an in-class like 300 question final. What we're going to do is you're going to do a case analysis. So I put in here as an example one. So this one, and the reason I threw this one in is this way you can see what it would look like. So this one has all kinds of details. So this was a project to upgrade a company called Merck. I didn't realize it was that old, 350 years old, pretty old company. So they have a project to remodel it, the company. But what you also get in this one, and why I put this in as a study aid to start with, somewhere down at the bottom, we're making it bigger. Scroll down. So they even had like how many bidders, and they have assignments through there. Keep going. So I included, in this case, this is one from an agency that does this for teaching assignments, and I went ahead and put this in. Because quite frankly, if I threw this out, you can find it on Course Hero or somewhere else. So the one you guys are going to do is what I'm going to build. So it will not have these questions and answers directly in Course Hero, but you can actually see what some of those learning objectives, the strategies, and in fact, there's a lit review talking about goal complex, and even the questions that we ask are all answered. So you can get a feel for what that kind of strategy should be. My hope is you'll have about 2 weeks to work on that through the last couple of weeks of school. So we'll give it to you in probably a week and a half to 2 weeks. That'll be due then finals week. So that way it solves a couple of problems that I have. One, our COVID rate is increasing in our state. I'm not sure we're going to be physically here or how many students are going to be here during that finals week before Thanksgiving. The other issue I have is I have finals that are scheduled on Tuesday afternoon. Who's going to be here on campus Tuesday afternoon of Thanksgiving week? Austin is. A couple of you, but a lot of people have travel plans, and so it's been kind of an interesting thing. So we're going to do a case assessment. So the case you're going to do, I will build, there will be some questions, there will be some writing in it, so writing skills will certainly be analysis skills, and it will take in parts that we've done throughout the year. So things like risk analysis will be in there. So there will be a, going through there, build a risk assessment. Those kinds of things. So things we've already done and things we're going to do then in the future are going to be in there. So you'll have to identify things like who are the stakeholders. That'll be part of those. So you'll have to read through really carefully and try to interpret that and figure out what those pieces will be. So
what you're saying is we're just going to have to read whatever you give us and answer the questions.
essentially, so you're going to have to develop your own analysis. So it's not just a one-line question. If there's a question, it will be a paragraph or more kind of response. But yes. So instead of doing an oral presentation, because I thought about trying to have everybody do individual ones and then tape them, and I went, the way this year's gone, this is going to go horribly bad. So we're going to revert back to kind of an older model that seems to be very valid out of that case analysis. So you're going to read about whatever I choose. And I've got 3 or 4 that I've been eyeballing. A couple of them are from England, which I thought was kind of interesting. Some studies that have gone on in England. Some very large ones. One of them that I've been looking at is, if you're interested in airplanes at all, is a case study and pulling some information on the 777 Dreamliner and how that project of getting it ready to build occurred. So there are some questions, but you'll also have to do some thinking through there. So
you're going to build a case?
I'm going to build the case.
Throughout it, we're answering
So not throughout it. At the end, there'll be a question and answer piece. You will have to do some external research on there to find some additional information regarding this case, but it will not be horribly overdone, I hope. So it should be easier in some ways than a group presentation, because the thought of that, my head just explodes, since it seems groups went horribly wrong. So we get dinged every year on assessment and accreditation because we don't have enough group work. We take a study, and some of you guys have done some of those NESI surveys where you compare yourself to other universities and colleges, and the thing that we always get hammered on there is we don't have enough group work. And now I remember why we don't have enough group work. But it's even worse on some of the online classes when we've tried to apply it, so I don't feel quite as bad. And at this point, 2020 has hammered us into the ground a little bit. So this is an example. So I would look at that, kind of keep that in the back of my mind. Not only does it have the example of what a case study would look like, but it's got kind of that question and answers pieces throughout. Now, this one involves something we haven't talked a lot about here called agency theory. So don't get hung up on, hey, we haven't talked about agency theory, because we don't include it in our project management course here. We've got too much other stuff to shove in there. But you will see they're look at like bidding and some of these other concepts you've seen. So it's just a sample. So there would be no questions directly related to it other than including that as a piece for information. So the other piece, so Cengage, I've now given up with their tech support because I don't have enough hours in the day to wait on hold for them for hours and hours on hold and them not be able to fix our issue. So what I am going to do is I'm going to go in, and I think I'll probably do weeks 1 through 5, grab all the Cengage stuff and shove it manually into Blackboard, since we can't seem to get it to push over and sync correctly. So I'm not sure. I have some classes that are working fine, some that aren't. Cengage doesn't seem to have an idea what the problem is. One of the things is we changed Blackboard models. We went to hosted on Amazon Web Services instead of being directly hosted on Blackboard's site. Weird that some work and some don't. And in fact, in this class, I've noticed now some assignments will show up in the gradebook and some won't. What was really weird was the other night I did a force refresh. I was on the phone with them. We were trying to fix it. We did a force refresh, and some of the assignments that were working all of a sudden vanished out of the gradebook then. So I'm just kind of abandoning that plan, and I'm going to manually shove in grades. So watch for that. So the flip side of that is if you look and you go, man, I really haven't done all those Cengage assignments I probably should have for the first couple of weeks. Go back in and do them. Most of you have done a really good job. If you haven't, make sure you go in and do those, and that way we don't have any yelling or screaming or weird things. So, that one up real quick. So I linked in here, and so this is an article at PMI. So this is really the overarching authority on project management. And so there's a lot of articles in here. So project termination is what we're going to talk about today. And so I threw in an additional article one of the things we have to think about is in our businesses today, the world evolves a little quicker than it used to. And now all of a sudden, what may have been a 3-year project, we have to come up with ways to end it very quickly. Maybe we're running out of funding, and certainly COVID has affected a lot of businesses. Maybe even pre-COVID, all of a sudden the world moves around us much faster. So you're developing a product that's supposed to work on an Apple iOS 13, and suddenly they throw out version 14, your stuff doesn't work. How do I stop this project and try to recover? And so we're going to talk a lot about those kinds of pieces. So let me throw this up here and get a start on some of this. So this is really that idea. How do we stop our project? How do we close it? And closing a project is kind of interesting. Let me flip those so you can see the whole thing. So what do we do when we close a project? What do we do with all that information that we gathered? And where do we store it? And we even do some weird things on a lot of projects. We bring in different people. Why would we bring in a different project manager? Jack or Jim or Mark or Mary or Lacey or whoever has been our project manager, they work just fine during the entire project until we hit the end. And then we replace them. That doesn't necessarily make sense until we start thinking about why that might be and what the reasons are or why we would do something like that. So we're going to look at, so there's a couple of assignments in here, so we're going to look at some of those really quickly. But if I look at our project, and I look at it over time, and over time, if we look how much stuff is going on, so there's a few people involved when we begin this project. As we start getting into the planning, we start adding a few more people, and we start adding effort, or we start adding resources, and then that project swells usually. And then close to getting done, all of a sudden it's got a very steep drop. Things get completed and we start shuffling crews and people and assignments to other organizations. And so we start peeling them off pretty quickly. And so there is a time at the end of this project where we call that the deliverables. So whether it's a construction project, whether it's a software project, whether it's hiring a new person project, whatever it is, at the end of that project there is something called a deliverable. What is this project designed to do? So if it's rebuilding this building, that is the deliverable. In other words, we transfer it from the construction phase to now we're back into the control of the college. Or if we're building a highway, suddenly that is open, it's done. If we're building a software product, it's in beta testing and about to be distributed out. So Microsoft has built the latest version of Windows 10, it's about to be delivered. That's when we agree on that project is really getting close to done. Are there deliverables through that project? Yes. So those are those milestones, but this is when we finally accept the closing of it. So think about a house. There's milestones when you build a house. There's a milestone of, hey, we got the foundation poured. Hey, we have the walls built. That's a milestone. The roof's on. It's what we call dried in. In other words, it's environmentally sound on the inside and you can start doing inside work. So those are all a milestone along here. That deliverable would be, I get that certificate of occupancy. In other words, it's passed all of the inspections. Now we get handed that certificate of occupation. That doesn't mean that the project is done. So there's probably a few check-off lists. There's things we have to finalize. So in the terms of a house, you have to finalize that financing. So you'd have to feel that piece. And so it really comes down to when do we decide we end the project. So final payments are due. So in the case of a house, the bank hands the builder that last check, and you go in and sign all those documents that mean that you're going to be paying for the rest of your life for this new house you just had built. So one of them that sometimes gets lost is your staff, the people that are involved on this project. So people like praise. They like praise a lot more than they like getting yelled at. And so sometimes we have to think about those behaviors and how we treat our staff. And we also want to evaluate them. And we can evaluate them in a positive manner. So are there things they could have done differently? Probably. But are there things they did really well? So make sure there's a balance of those in there. And we evaluate what happened. We also look at the entire project. And we say, how did this house build go? What are things that we needed to do differently? What went wrong? What went right? How did our schedule? And we can use all these things we've learned, like that economic value or earned value of a project. How did our numbers turn out? Was it on budget, on target, on time? We document everything we've learned. Because if we're going to continue doing those, if we're going to be a house builder, and we're going to continue to build houses, we can learn from what we just did, and we can say, all right, so the next time we build a house, we're going to do this, this, and this differently. So we know that in the Lincoln market, we've got to contact that building inspector 2 weeks beforehand. So we have to estimate better. A lot of times housing projects and construction get stopped because they're waiting on things like inspections. Nothing is more frustrating than to just sit there and wait because you didn't call the inspector quickly. Or in the case of construction projects, you didn't call 811 and get utilities marked, and you've got to sit there and wait 48 hours for them to come out and mark those utilities. Those kinds of things are very frustrating. That's part of that learned lesson. And so we archive them. And so there is specialized software to archive projects. Most companies really just throw it all in a binder. But it's that historical legacy. And that's why those project managers that have been around for a long time, they've done many projects. They know the pitfalls, and they know what worked previously. So they have that historical insight of what's going on. And so this is kind of our life cycle of that project. When we're done, here's some of the things we got to do. So we want to get paid. So all along we've had those milestones. We've got checks. We want to make sure that everything got paid. Did we get all those payments? Did we get a final payment? So one thing that happens in a lot of projects is there is something called a holdback or a contingency fee. So at the end of your project, you built your house. That builder sets in a special escrow type of an account. So in other words, I can't really touch it. A fee. And so we've negotiated that at the beginning that there is something like usually a 10% fee in there. That fee sits there for a set amount of time. So maybe it's 90 days, maybe it's a year, maybe it's 6 months. That way, if problems arise in that house, they're paid out of that contingency. So I haven't paid my builder. So I've paid them 90%, for example, of everything due. I don't pay them that final 10% until a year out. Or if I'm financing, the bank typically will hold that 10%. And so that way, if foundation cracks, hopefully there's enough money in that to pay that and we don't have to sue the builder. We just take it out and we go, well, we fixed this problem you did, so now you don't get the full 10%. There's only 2% of that money left. So that happens in our project. We need to make sure that all payments are made to others. Because those subcontractors, supplies, vendors, whoever else is involved in this project, that they all get paid. And that allows us then to figure out what our actual cost on a project is. If you've ever built a house, these things kind of happen where builders sometimes don't pay subcontractors. They don't pay things like concrete vendors. Guess who those people come after? So if they can't get it from the builder, they come back after you. How would you like to buy a new house, just spent $300,000 on it, and then you get a bill for $20,000 in concrete, and they say, well, you're either going to pay it or you put a lien against your house that's going to sit there and you can't ever sell your house. And that can happen. So that's why that document, those accounting people, are very important, making sure that all those payments are made. So finally, at the end, we close all those out. We're going to compare costs. What did we actually spend? By the time we got it built, what did it take in manpower compared to our estimates? The more times we do this, the more cycles of this, we should get closer and closer and closer and closer to being accurate. Are we ever going to be completely accurate? No. There are too many variables in some of these projects that we're never going to be 100% accurate. Personnel are always going to be varying performance, so sometimes that's going to be an issue. We don't have control over external events, things like new laws, new standards, new things that happen. We don't have any ability to control material costs throughout that project unless we buy all the materials up front. But then we have those storage costs and maintenance costs of that equipment. So there's always going to be things that we're not going to have. And usually, and I know it seems silly, but we always want to recognize those people that were involved. So those little celebrations, and you've seen them here when we finished a product, we'll have something together, and we'll say, yay, everybody does really great. And it's kind of a form of that idea of ego stroking, because we want to recognize people. They could have been on other projects, they could have done other things. In some cases, we persuaded them to come work on our project. We want to celebrate that success. And sometimes we know when we celebrate it that, man, there were some things we could have done differently. The Performing Arts Center, when they finally finished that over a year late, did we still have a celebration? Yeah, we got together and said, we did this, now, what did we learn from this? And apparently Prue doesn't learn in some cases, because what project have you known that was on time at our school? Was Dalzell on time? Was the football field on time? Performing Arts Center? This building? I see a trend. And so there seems to be some issues with that. The only project I know that was really close to being on time was when they rebuilt the curve around the road here. And that one was really close. But part of that, they got some builders that were very quickly involved. And that was an interesting project because they had open project meetings during that. And at that semester, I was able to take our class to it for a while, until I got asked not to. So, students asked questions that they didn't want to answer. So one of them, when I look out this window and you can see that nice gentle curve, and I can see that crosswalk, but the crosswalk is over at the end here. How many of you actually walk all the way up to the crosswalk and over and down? I don't see hardly anybody doing that unless you happen to park down there. Where does everybody cross? Just right in the middle of that curve. So the idea was trucks didn't have to stop, cars didn't have to stop, and students would be safe and protected up here because they had a better sight lines, and now you're crossing down there. So your students a couple years ago in this class pointed that out to the engineers and the architects that were drawing this all up, and they didn't want to hear that. And they actually came up with a really great idea. It would have cost a little bit of money additionally, but I think it made a lot of sense was from this parking lot we have here that's got the visitors parking and all that you actually would just have an underground tunnel out to that parking lot. And they could have built a cut and cover when they did the paving. Would have been a great way to get over there, and we wouldn't have had the crosswalk, so students would have been protected. So at some point, I suspect we're going to have somebody get hit by a car if we haven't already. Because I see some people driving around that corner like maniacs. Probably some of our own students. It's not me. I drive a Prius. I can't barely get up the hill. So we also then, and this is where it gets a little tougher, we prepare individual. So everybody involved gets critiqued. Now, is critiquing really a bad thing? If you get a bad critique, and it sounds like we're just picking on you, that really is room for improvement in all of those areas. So, we critique. So, look how our knowledge expanded. What do we need further development? And we give that to your managers or your performance people above you, whoever that happens to be. And that can lead to performance plans. And I know everybody thinks we're always going to do everything perfect. But I will say it's kind of nice sometimes to hear, you know, you're doing really good in this area, but this is an area I can see you're struggling. And if you're struggling, you're doing something wrong, you kind of know it. And you go, all right, so I know I'm not dealing with my customers the way I should. What can I do? And maybe we send you to a class, or we have a one-on-one training session, and we try to get that skill built up. Critiques and performance evaluations are really a good thing. But in our head, we're all very ego-driven, and if we don't get a 4 out of 4, everybody in here goes, man, that sucks. Horrible. I don't know what I'm doing. They're probably going to fire me. there are sometimes people get fired off performance evaluations, and that's really when they do horribly, horribly bad and don't improve when they've been asked to. So we do need to come up with a way that we move forward. So a lot of times we'll grab everybody together and we'll have big team meetings. And this is interesting, and I think these are going to change to virtual because great, we can't get together in person anymore. But we look at all those things. So our technical performance, was our quality in this project where we needed it to be? Did we meet the targets? Now remember, quality in some of these targets are set by that charter. They're not set by what we have in our brain. They're set by the written standards we've created. So that quality may be not what we think it should be. So maybe we're making equipment. We've designed a factory to build a piece of equipment. We don't think it's really the greatest piece of equipment, but did it meet those targets? And so that's what we have to look at, is does it meet those targets? How did we manage changes? And so every project's going to have some changes. How did we handle that? Did we do it correctly? Did that drive costs or did that drive quality? What did we have to make changes? Budget, schedule, project planning. Did our risk management seem to make sense? So our contingency budgeting and our contingency for time and other things, did that make sense in light of our risk analysis? So if those lined up, that's really good. Customer relationships and our stakeholder relationships. Did we engage those customers? Did we engage those stakeholders? And they're not always necessarily the same groups, but oftentimes they are. So if I think about it, Peru State College was the customer for the construction company that redid this building. But there's additional stakeholders. So there might be a governor's office, or there might be the LB 409 group that funds it out of cigarette tax money. All those might be stakeholders that are in addition to those customers. So whoever's a stakeholder in there, so sometimes those are different groups. How did we respond to them? Teams. How did our teams or groups do? So if we were doing a critique of our project, did groups do well? No. So we need to revise and come up with some better plans. And so I need to come up, if I'm going to do groups again, to come up with some better ways to handle groups. Some way to incentivize and get people to work together somehow magically. Communications. Were there flaws? Did things happen as planned? Or did we have some gaps? Are there some things we could do to improve communication? And maybe it's that communications back to that stakeholder. Maybe we didn't do that often enough. Maybe we needed to come up with a website. And so you see this pretty commonly. So in a lot of large buildings, they'll have a website where they have a time-lapse webcam every day taking pictures of construction progress. People are interested, whether they're in the stakeholders group or the customers group, or sometimes they're just interested citizens who may have some interest in the project. If we have problems, and when I say if, I mean when we have problems, every project is going to have some kind of problem, whether it's resolution of people's own faults, whether we have conflict with groups, with teams, with equipment, with whatever it is. At some point in a project, you're going to have some kind of an issue. How do I fix the issue and move on and lead to lessons learned for the next group so that they don't repeat that particular issue? So that leads us to that idea of what did we learn? And those are those takeaways. So when we look at it, we say, man, we're going to do another project. What did we learn from the last time we did a project? What did we learn? How do we move on? And that leads to what can we do in the future better? So the one I like right now is Peru is in the middle of an assessment process. So if you don't know how we're doing this, Peru State College is part of the Higher Learning Commission, and that is who gives us our credentials to say that you guys actually get a degree, essentially. So if we don't pass assessment, things like financial aid disappear. Our ability to offer degrees disappears. So this group, every 10 years, they have an on-site visit if you're doing well. If you're not, they come visit you a lot more often. And it really is a project. And so, well, the hope is you're doing it in a continuous manner, making improvements in, are students actually learning? Are your classes relevant to what we're trying to teach? Do they match what you say you're teaching them? Do your student learning outcomes match what you say they are? So there's a lot of data that we're trying to collect. That's part of this idea of lessons learned. So the last time they were here 10 years ago, we were kind of given, these are some of the ideas that we have, that you did really good in all these areas, but here's some things you could do for improvement. And one of the things that we didn't have then was our document storage was all paper, and it was really kind of horrible about how we store things like minutes of even meetings. Because they go in and they look at those as evidence of, does it go to faculty senate? Does it go to the assessment committee? Does it go to IRB for student research? And so we've implemented some changes. Now, I wanted to go further, and I would love to do some things, but there's limits to our structure and organization here. But we've learned some of those items. So now, 10 years later, we're redoing this again. So there's been some changes in what they're looking at. And now there's new groups formed, and I happen to be on one of the committees that's looking at one of these areas. One of the big changes that came about was 10 years ago, this report, well, it's actually about 8 now that it actually came out. So the report that was written 8 years ago, each group wrote each section individually. And so each section looked really good, and it sounded great. But when you looked at it from an overall viewpoint, you could tell that different individuals and different groups had worked on different sections. It didn't have a cohesive flow. Similar to, we can look at a paper that somebody writes by cutting and pasting in chunks from different articles. It doesn't have that flow to it. Or if you have a lot of people working in a group project, sometimes you can see who wrote what pieces by the way they write. And so this year, because we now have somebody in charge of assessment on our campus, they're going to do the majority of the writing so that it's in one voice. And so there's some rules about how that writing is supposed to be done, but that's even changed a little bit. So we take those lessons, we said, this is what worked before, but this is what we were asked, this is what other universities have seen. So we mix all those lessons together when we start this next project of how do we keep our assessment in 2022? And I know you guys are all like, man, I'm going to be gone by then. What does it matter? What happens if you're out and apply for a job and it's in the news that Peru State College has lost their assessment? Oh, man, that college degree is not going to be worth a whole lot, is it? And there are universities that have lost their assessment. So it's a way that we protect students also, because the ones that tend to lose it are the ones that are doing things like diploma minutes. Hey, you paid $500, you get your college degree. And you guys are like, man, I had to work my butt off to get that college degree. So it's that lessons learned. How do we find those lessons learned?
For the bigger colleges, do they have assessments?
No, it's really, all of them tend to work on a 10-year plan, unless you get dinged for a lot of issues. So, and then they'll be on a more frequent basis when they'll come back. So if you get dinged at one of the 10-year assessments and really bad, they will give you a couple of years to come back and fix those issues and rewrite another report. They'll probably come down and visit on site also. Because what they've discovered over the years, if we just send in a paper report, does that match what's actually on the campus? And so the ones that have really gotten dinged are the online diploma mills. Colorado Technical University is one of them that comes to mind. American University, there's a couple of them that, if you see them advertising, like when you used to be able to fly, in those days you could fly, and they have those airline magazines, and you see the degrees, and there's a, for $5,000 you can get your college degree. Those are the ones that tend to get hammered. But we've had ones that were local that were closed for assessment. So Midland Lutheran nearly lost their accreditation a couple of years ago, and they've come back and done really well. ITT Vatterott, you used to hear ads for those all the time. That was part of the reason they lost and are gone, is they couldn't get accredited and students couldn't get financial aid. Well, students can't get financial aid. There's not enough people paying money directly out of their pocket. That said, there are a few universities that are willing to go, nope, I don't need assessment from you guys. We can do it ourselves. But it has to be universities that have a large enough endowment that they can be kind of self-supporting. So some place like Harvard could say, you know what, we have $1 billion+ in our endowment. Our financial aid for our students comes out of that endowment, not from anything federal. Go away. And the name value of a degree from Harvard is probably enough that that would work. Unfortunately, we're at Peru State. And does anybody know where we're at? I get a call at least a week asking, what? Are you in South America? No, we're in Nebraska. What? What's Nebraska? So there's power in that name recognition. And that's one of the things, quite honestly, we've had as a recommendation is, should we change the name of the college? Does that make sense to change the name of the college? One of them that happens is people don't understand the difference between a college and a university. And so even changing it to the Nebraska State University system would probably have a big impact, not necessarily here, but when you're recruiting for online students across the country. So, one of those things that happens, because that name recognition does play a role. It really does. People understand where Creighton University is across the country. It's got that name recognition, or UNL, or KU. They don't understand where Peru is. So documentation. Why do we do it? Why do we do all this documentation? Why do we do all this documentation of students here? So we take a lot of stuff out of it. So you'll see more and more classes where they'll say this is an assignment that we're going to submit to a repository. So we're adding in classroom-based assessments. So we're trying to figure out if you're actually learning those lessons that we're trying to put in there. We used to do something, and I don't know if any of you were around when we did the CAP testing. So we would make you come in as a freshman, and you would sit all day long and take this written test where you'd circle, color in the oval, and then we made you do it as a senior. And we held a little stick over your head and said, man, if you don't come in and take this test, we're going to hit you on the head and you're not going to be able to graduate. And we looked at those numbers and we said, if you don't improve enough or you're at a certain level, you can't graduate. You had to take like 6 hours of additional education. Well, what we found out is students fairly quickly understood the purpose of that, so they would Christmas tree the one as a freshman. They would put a minimal amount of effort into the one as a senior. And so did it really give us any valid information about how the students did? No. No. It was pretty horrible. And we even put in all these weird rules about online students. If you lived within 100 miles, you had to actually drive down and show up and take it. And so you'd have somebody who lived 99.9 miles and go, oh, I'm exempt. And it was horrible. So we had other ways you could get around it. You could take one of the graduate exams. But as a performance measure, we figured out this doesn't really work. And so that's one of the things when we document stuff, we go, man, all right, we know that didn't work. How do we improve that? So now we've come out with some of these ideas, and we're going through general studies courses in a lot of them right now. And we're taking data from existing assignments or assignments we've tailored to match some of those. And we look then at, so we can pull data from, for example, we're doing that in our CMIS 101 class. But we're doing that for any class that qualifies as a technology course. So we're also doing it for some art classes and some education classes. And then we can look at that data, and that gives us an idea of where our students are and how we can help them improve. So, knowledge-based systems, so some repository where we can get it back is ideal. So, in a lot of companies, they'll have a system, sometimes based on SharePoint or other technologies, and we can look through that data, and we can see how the last projects have done. So, when we're trying to identify how long something's going to take, we have experience to look at. We know what happened the last couple of projects. So we can pull that data. Now, there is a little bit of weirdness here in some companies. Some companies are very tight-lipped. They don't want even their own employees to know what they did last week. And so it makes it really hard. If that company isn't open to sharing that information with employees, then it's a little bit problematic. And if you're scared of your employees knowing what you've done as a company, you've probably hired the wrong employees. Or you've got a wrong attitude. They need that information. You want those employees to be self-sustaining. So record keeping throughout it. So we want to grab stuff as it goes. We all have that idea. I can remember what I did yesterday. Or I can remember those notes that I was supposed to take today, but I forgot to bring a notebook or a pencil or a pen or whatever. We think we can do that, and then next week comes. Oh, man, I knew I was supposed to do something. Oh, I was supposed to get new milk, because the old milk is chunky, and we don't remember that. So if we do those as we go, and there are a lot of project managed software tools that are slightly different than Project Manager, because it does other pieces, so you can put in notes and all kinds of things. So generally we have meetings throughout a project, and so we discuss them, and we try to capture things as quickly as possible. So if we see something isn't working, we try to make changes. So groups aren't working. We make changes so that we can get through the semester, and we try to make those changes. We try to do things as quickly as we can. So we also can then take that data, and so the term you a lot of times see is big data. In other words, we've got all these pieces of data, and we need to be able to mine it. In other words, to see if there's trends or things where that are happening inside of here, our project, that we didn't know what happens. So what we may find is that overall, our project maybe broke even or made money. But we lost money on certain components of it because we underbid some pieces of it. So perhaps one of the areas we underbid was flooring. And so we didn't take into account, we had completely wrong estimates about how long it was going to take to floor something, or put flooring and carpeting and tile. Overall, we still made money. But when we start examining that, we say, wow, the flooring section didn't do that well. How do we data mine and come up with that to analyze that a little better? So when we bid or we plan or we're going to do future projects, that gives us some knowledge about what happened and why, and leads us to those better numbers that we can come up with. It's also beneficial to talk to our customer and our clients. What do they think we did different? We may have wildly different ideas. We think, hey, we survived and we broke even and we're only a week late. They're focused on, hey, why were you a week late? I had to have that dorm room ready for students, and I had to make alternative plans because it wasn't ready for a week until after students arrived. So two different viewpoints. And so we need to examine that and see what those customers. Because the other problem is, in the 1800s, my customers couldn't talk to each other except by telegram or if they ran into each other in the local saloon. That's not the case today. Now, if you screw up on a project, it's out there immediately. Usually before the project is done, you see things on Facebook or social media about it. And I'm like, oh, crap, how do we fix it? So, meeting with that customer, one of the things you're also doing is you're hopefully setting it up for future sales and future projects, because you'd like to continue working with these guys. You've already got a relationship, hopefully a good one. So if I can set that up at the end and I look at what we did, what happened, hopefully that leads to the idea that we can continue that relationship. So feedback. Sometimes we'll even give them a survey. We don't want to give them so much stuff that you go, I'm not going to bother filling this out. And sometimes face-to-face is a really great way to get that. Yeah. Again, today in the COVID era, sometimes it's a little difficult to do that. But look at future opportunities. Hey, it looks like we all kind of agreed we did pretty good. I see what we need to fix this area. That flooring, we got to fix that. And we're working on it. So if you guys have some future stuff you're working on, maybe we can plan together and come up with that. Getting your hooks in there. If you're going to continue, it really is that opportunity to be a salesman. The other thing a lot of times we do is we want to use you as a reference. So if we're selling something to you or a project, we need references for the future. So people will call Peru State College and say, hey, how did Samson Construction do for you? Or whoever it is was here. And we can then talk to them and have that interaction. Now, one thing I caution you on is make sure it's a good reference. I had a student, when I taught production and operations management, that this little student decided he was going to try to cheat his way through the class and fail. He took it again and didn't do so well because he couldn't remember that he cheated the first time apparently. Didn't turn a bunch of stuff in and failed. And finally took it the third time and he passed. in this was one of our students who came out of the military. And so the military has an honor code, so it was very sad that he's cheating and doing some things that he shouldn't have. It was also pretty apparent in school that he was also drinking by 9 in the morning coming to class. Had some substance use issues. I sympathize and empathize, but it's not acceptable to an employer. So he actually calls me after he graduated and says, hey, can I use you for a reference? The words he left out were good reference. So make sure that reference is what you think it is if you're going to use those as an employer. So the first employer, they called me and I talked to them and I knew them actually, is why I think he was trying to use me. And I had that conversation. I said, he can probably do a really great job if he decides to, and you probably need to make, and I wasn't going to say, hey, he's, drinking out of a flask in school, but, I kind of tried to warn them a little bit. Unfortunately, he got fired in about 6 months, because apparently they didn't like the fact he's taking in vodka with his coffee or something. Who knows? Plenty companies. So make sure you get that permission, and make sure it's what you think it is. So ask them, talk to them. If you're going to build that relationship and continue working with them, it's worth that effort. So, who's involved? Team members, customer reps, project managers. And I'm going to say project managers because oftentimes there's multiple project managers. And one of the strategies we often use in larger projects is we have dedicated closers. And so these dedicated closers, let me scroll back to this. So, further back. Too far back. Come back to my sheet where I see. So, in this chart, Lisa's been our project manager, and we get to about here, and all of a sudden we pull Lisa. And we start her on another project. And we bring in a dedicated group of closers. Sometimes those closing activities are different enough that it makes sense for us to bring in dedicated closing project managers. And you'll see that often. Well, it does a lot of things. And some of it does is we know that as you're working on this project, you have some inherent biases building up. It allows us to make a clean close. So those people that are working that closing, that's what they do. They're specialists in that idea of closing out a project. So we also can then assess the records of project manager A or Lisa. And hopefully she's got everything, and there's a handoff procedure when you do that. And it's very, very common for us to do that. So we bring in somebody else to close it out. So they have the specialties, the knowledge to bring that in. So if it's a construction project, sometimes they'll bring in their own construction people. So the main crews have left, and then you have a bunch of people that's what they do is finish out those kinds of projects. So they're specialists in that area. Or maybe they have some skills or abilities depending on what that project is. In software, kind of the same issue. This is where you'll bring in people that are doing the testing to make sure that project really works as expected. Hopefully it's been tested before then, but ways to close that project out. And so we bring in new people. And sometimes that seems like if you don't understand that and you're working as a project manager, and then they walk in and you go, man, wait, I don't get to finish this project? I started it. And so it's when you have to understand what the impact of that and why they would bring in different people. And sometimes it's simply due to different skill set levels, too, of what's going on. So usually the closers are the more experienced. They're the ones that do that warm, fuzzy handoff. And sometimes we have to explain that to our clients, that why are you doing that? Why are we bringing in somebody different? What's the reason for that? So this is an example of a survey, but I will say that trying to do it this way, sometimes it's better, quite frankly, of that face-to-face. You're doing the filling out and talking to them. Sometimes this works, but a lot of times those customers don't have time. They're already busy. They're not trying to implement whatever it is you built or done for them. So they understand it, but sometimes it's easier to get that information. But if I look at it and I get that data, I can certainly look at it for trends and see what's going on. And that's that idea of getting that reference piece. It's really critical that we can say, if you come up to me and say, well, yeah, I'll build your house. Oh, okay, I need some references of people that I can talk to. Oh, I don't have any of those. That's going to be a red flag right there. That if nobody's willing to go, so you've either never built a house before or every reference you have is bad. something says there's something wrong with that. And that can certainly happen. So, at the end, this project, sometimes we have to think about, how do I terminate it early? So, what might be a reason we need to terminate something early? Lack of funding? Funding comes to mind. A lot of times we end up with, so we spent over budget, maybe changes have happened, and suddenly we have to figure out a way to end it. This building is an example of that, where the financial need was greater than the ability to fund it. And so one of the things they did was bring in some of Peru's own people to try to finish some of those activities. And so we had to end it for financial reasons. And that's a really, really common one. What might be another reason? What about environmental factors? In other words, could laws change or regulations change that cause us to change that? Yeah, we could certainly have that. What if the project's going really badly? If you're building a house, but every day it gets worse and worse and it's more crooked, are you going to continue to let them build this house for you, or at some point are you going to pull the plug and say, whoa, we got to stop this? So maybe the project itself has went bad. Maybe we're building this house for me, and I was going to have 2 children, and now my wife has octuplets, and we're going to pop out, 8 babies. That house is going to have to be a lot bigger. Maybe the needs have changed for that client, and we have to pull that. So, technology changes. So if we're doing software, for example, technology needs can change really, really, really quickly. So, not every project gets finished. There's a lot of them that don't because of whatever reason or whatever need. Federal government projects, if you start looking at them, they're rift with those. If you look at the FBI, for example, they were going to replace their desktops and their systems. They managed to spend $500 million before they decided to pull the plug. Because what they were going to implement didn't really fit the new needs that they discovered that they really needed. And it was so far behind, so over budget, that we've had issues with those kinds of things. So there's a lot of reasons that a project could terminate early. So there's just a few that are book lists. So what are success things? So what can we make sure that our project is a success? What kind of things do we regularly see? So recognition of those people involved in it, not just at the end, but through that project. It's a lot easier to get people to do things if you're doing it in a very nice, kind manner versus if you're just shouting at them every day. People don't respond well to just being shouted at every day to try to get stuff done. And if every day you go to work and you go, man, I know I'm going to be behind and my boss is being a dick to me, I'm not going to be willing to do a whole lot of stuff. So think about that recognition throughout the entire project, and especially at the end. Talk to your customers all the time, not just at the end. Set up regular meetings, maybe a weekly meeting where you just phone in and say, hey, I saw you were on our job site the other day. What do you think about? Bring them on site and show them something. Or if you're building software, say, here, let me show you what's going on. Let me show you this model we've built for you. Or if you're looking at something, see who's involved in this project. If you're hiring people, talk to those people. Say, hey, we've got 25 applicants. We're looking at them. Whatever that project is, let those clients know what's going on. If you're a wedding planner, show them samples of wedding cake or something to get them interested back in that project. So there's not a big surprise at the end. So, we need to evaluate it. We need to capture those lessons. And we need to establish some way to access that data in the future. So whether it's a paper-based system and you got to thumb through, but hopefully it's some kind of knowledge-based database system where I can look up and say, carpeting, let me look and see what we've done historically, and we can get some information for it. So documentation, organize it, plan it, come up with some way that it makes sense for us. Organize it, and retain those customer pieces. What did the customer say about us? It's important. Not just the good stuff, because sometimes the customers can be brutal and say, I know everything else was great, but Those guys doing the carpet, I saw them outside smoking more than I saw them putting down carpeting. Oh, all right. Now let me think about those pieces and come up with some employee performance plans. Maybe there's a reason they're doing that. So those are all kinds of those pieces. So closing the chapter is actually a pretty quick process in some cases. But we have to always be aware we may need to close that process quickly. So when we think about these projects, something like a wedding. So a wedding is a good example. We've all been to one. Some of us have been in one or two, or not three, hopefully ever. But if you're in that wedding, are there things that can go wrong? Think about that as a way to look at things. Because we all have those ideas in our head about what that wedding's going to look like. So if I had to close a wedding early, what might be a reason for that? That they break up? That happens. Think about all those wedding plans that have happened that have changed due to COVID. I actually saw one of our students that graduated last year was posting on Facebook that they had to postpone their wedding now, or that end date had to change in some cases.
How about my best friend still thinks she's going to get to go to Mexico for her destination wedding in December?
Well, reality is probably going to hit her very hard, unfortunately. Although, maybe you can get to Mexico. I don't think so. If you get out of the country, I'm not sure you're going to get back in, so there may be that issue. But think about those things that can happen. How does that project terminate? How do I end that project where everybody is still smiling? Still smiling. So I used to DJ weddings. Weddings are a stressful event. Any project is. The worst wedding I ever got to see as being a DJ was there were already some fighting. Because even when I just met with them to discuss what we're going to play and do, they were a little cranky with each other. It was a weird vibe. And I got to the wedding venue, set all my stuff up. They had their ceremony in the church next door, so it was a Knights of Columbus Hall next door to the church. And they come out, and we did the first dance, and it was just kind of an odd vibe in this wedding. Everybody was pretty drunk. It was a Volga German area. Drinking had started at about 9 in the morning. And then all of a sudden the bride is gone, and nobody can find the bride. So we're hanging out. It's about half an hour later, and all of a sudden there's a commotion. Oh, interesting. Well, the bride had left the venue, and she was in the company of two young men, and they got into a car wreck. Now, luckily nobody was injured, but the two young men, neither one was her husband, and they seemed to have lost their clothing between the time they left the venue and the time they had a car wreck. And so there was a car wreck, the driver was taken away for DUI, stark naked, and people come back, and the wedding seemed to have a really bad vibe, and the father of the bride just came up and said, I think we can pull the plug and go home now. Alright, so we terminated that wedding dance early. Was anybody happy? Did we learn lessons? I learned a lesson. That's when I started getting all my money up front. Because had that father of the bride not been a really nice guy, any of those vendors on there were probably stuck at that point. Right? And now, it was a sad, horrible thing. But how do we end those projects? And so we're always along the way, we're thinking about, how do I make this project end at some point? So I'm talking to my customers. Now, in a wedding, we're not going to really say, your daughter's not planning on cheating on the wedding night, is she? It's probably not the way we would word that question, but you might think of, are there any obstacles? So if I have a construction project, what are obstacles and hurdles that might come up? Why would we maybe need to end this early? Why would we need to crash this project? And so sometimes these vendors and customers will be really upfront with you, and you can sometimes also see those warning signs. So if you're doing a construction project and they're getting later and later and later paying you for their regularly monthly payments, do you need to start being prepared for that project may fail? Don't do like I did when I was running a construction company. And we were very generous, but we were putting a lot of eggs in our baskets, and we had some vendors that we weren't paying because our customers weren't paying, and it got pretty ugly. And so when our biggest client owed us about $50 million, failed for bankruptcy, That's kind of the writing on the wall that we're going to be pulling some of those projects back, right? So how do I do it successfully? Documentation. I know we all hate the paperwork part, but that's what actually in most projects is the most valuable thing when they end. How do I use that skills and move forward and go in the future? All right. So everybody's got their assignment for week 9. All right. So here's why I ran through there. Oh, come back here. So if you notice, week 9, and I will send out an announcement, I get to go visit a neurologist. Everybody say, yay, that sounds like fun. No, not so much. But the only appointment he could get is during what class? You guys. So I ran through this a little quick. I looked at rescheduling. His reschedule, when I talked to the receptionist, was, well, I think by the end of December he's got an opening somewhere. No, all right, this appointment will work. We'll go. So I will not be here on Thursday for your class. Everybody clap and go, yay. All right. It's not as horrible as going to the proctologist. No, I'm just kidding. It's fine. But so make sure you go through and you do the activities in here. Look at this case example, and then this is that additional example I have in some additional information on closing projects, why we might terminate early, why some of those reasons make sense. Sometimes we terminate a project early, so for software, we're wanting to get it done quickly so we can get out on the market. So think about a project to develop a food item. Maybe we need to close it early, somehow slide that food product out early so that we can beat the competition. So there's some additional information in there. Make sure you do the stuff for week 6, and I will send out an email or an announcement. But we are going to be closing out in that Cengage from 1 to 5, and I'm going to shove it into Blackboard, kind of the old-fashioned way. So make sure you've done that stuff in Cengage. So if you haven't, and you get a 0 shoved across, and you're crying and you're sad, I gave you a warning. All right? Any questions? All right. Anybody want to pay my bill at the neurologist? No, just kidding.